Welcome everybody. This is the Digital Divide, the problem, the call to action session. Would like to do just a few introductions. So before we really kick off our subject matter today. So my name is Amina Fazlullah and I'm with Common Sense Media. I am the Digital Equity Counsel and I've been working on connectivity issues for well over a decade, both domestically and internationally. Just most recently, I've been focused on understanding the distance learning digital divide impacted by the pandemic and trying to get a sense of the size of it, what we need to close it, the costs associated with closing it, and then what are sort of the long-term structure we can put in place to keep it closed. And then I'm going to just kind of tick off to the next person, and then I'll let you guys choose who you want to pass it along for your introduction. So Evan, go ahead.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm Evann Freeman. I'm the Director of Government Relations at EPB in Chattanooga, which is the Electric Power Board. We're the municipal electric company for Hamilton County located in Chattanooga, which is southeast Tennessee. Thanks for having me today.
Daniela.
Over to you.
All right, sorry, Daniela Fairchild. Hi, everyone. I am the director for the state's Office of Innovation in Rhode Island, and we have a program called Connect RI, working with our public housing authorities and our K-12 districts to support internet access, device access, and digital literacy skills across the board.
Hey everyone, I'm Daniel Anello of Kids First Chicago, the CEO, and we're a parent advocacy and policy system change org. And I had the opportunity to work with parents to kind of elevate the issue of internet connectivity in Chicago, and we launched a program called Chicago Connected here, which we'll talk about in a moment.
Great. Well, thanks everybody for joining us today. As I mentioned, at Common Sense, we've been working on trying to get a sense of the size and scope of the issue around distance learning, the digital divide, and even previous to the pandemic, we focused on issues around what we called the homework gap. And because of the pandemic, I think the term homework gap just didn't seem appropriate anymore. And I think we wanted to try to really get a sense of what the new definition actually is now that students are at home or doing some kind of hybrid learning. So what we found in our first report back in June, when we tried to use existing data to try to get a sense of who would fall into the distance learning digital divide, was that the distance learning digital divide actually requires us to think differently about what's needed. When we were talking about the homework gap previous to the pandemic, we looked at lots of different public solutions to be able to allow a student access to the internet. So after school access, libraries, other public institutions and anchor institutions, or even commercial institutions, walking into a store or coffee shop to be able to access the internet. Maybe even going to other family members. That's just not possible with the social distancing requirements related to COVID and the pandemic. And we're starting to see that and actually, even before the pandemic, we did a report in September 2019 where we surveyed teachers trying to get their perspective on the homework gap and how it's impacting their delivery of education. We found back in September of 2019 that it was impacting it, that it was distorting how they actually assigned homework and what type of homework they would assign and what type of assignments they would choose to do, even in schools that had great technology resources and that had one-to-one devices and had great teacher training. When they knew a student didn't have access at home, they felt that it was just unfair to be able to assign something that would require a student to need significant amounts of connectivity. And so, when the pandemic hit, we did a sort of a deep dive on what was needed. What we found was you needed to have a reliable and robust device, depending on the student. And this is probably of no surprise to anybody here, but a mobile phone was not going to cut it. You needed to have potentially a tablet or a laptop And it could be a laptop that is sort of lightweight. It could be a laptop that's a bit, more robust and heavier, depending on what you're trying to do. And I think that's also, that granularity is important because, we still want to see students succeed and get interested in things like STEM. And, you can't necessarily do everything you could do before in a classroom with, a tablet or maybe just even a lightweight laptop. So, devices really do matter. In addition to devices is connectivity. And connectivity can come in a whole host of different ways. And what we found in our first report, was you could have some form of distance learning, asynchronous distance learning with connectivity around 25.3. But it meant that a student was unable to do as much face-to-face interaction with teachers, with peers, with therapists, with other types of wraparound services, that they might experience a lot of interruptions and when they are doing any kind of distance learning or sort of synchronous heavy learning. And it was just sort of a limiting factor in terms of the delivery of education. What we found was for more robust synchronous distance learning, you need around 210 BPS. And that would allow for and account for multiple students in the household and potentially a more robust environment for learning. It would also allow for parents who might be doing remote work or telemedicine. And so, we felt like it was very important to sort of get a sense of, what the range looked like and what it meant when you didn't have what was ideal. We also put a number to that. We found, if we wanted to move quickly, we found that, we need to have every option on the table just because our infrastructure in this country is, it's varied and it's very different from locality to locality. And so, when we priced it out for sort of a national number, we had to keep all the options on the table. And in doing that, we found that the number came to about $11 billion to connect students and an additional $1 billion to connect teachers. We found that about 16 million students fell into the homework gap and that about another 500,000 teachers fell into this homework gap, the distance learning homework gap. And it was important that we, considered both students and teachers in this sort of sizing and scoping because, certainly students are important to connect to and every teacher that doesn't have high quality access to the internet or the device that they need, it just means that all those other students that they are teaching are impacted. So that's kind of what we found, and that's where things stood. Our second report started to dig into all the work that schools did, and what we found, and I think the biggest takeaway is that schools have been doing incredible work, and states have been doing incredible work to try to close this distance learning digital divide, as the folks on this call will tell you, and have been doing great work around assessments, really creative things around procurement, and finding really creative ways to deal with funding issues. And with that, I think I'm going to pass to Evan, and we can go from there.
Yeah, so a little bit about our program. It's called HCS EdConnect, which is Hamilton County Schools Ed Connection, powered by EPB. How we came to that is back at the beginning of March, as students are going home, the superintendent reached out to our CEO and really just asked, or he's saying that he's hearing from families that they're not going to have internet access. They're sending everybody home. They're, coming up with curriculum and they have devices to go home with most students, but that connection piece is not there. So what can we do? The first thing we did immediately was that we put up about 95 Wi-Fi hotspots across the county, in parking lots, churches, community centers, places that people are familiar with and recognize. And so that you could come, pull up and connect to the internet. That was the first piece of our project. But what we're really wanting to do is something more long-term. The conversation of closing the digital divide is something that we've talked about for a long time, but this is an opportunity to do something something bold that's never been done before. So we our CEO put together just a group of community leaders. We had the city mayor, city of Chattanooga, the Hamilton County mayor, our school system. We had our foundations, a couple of private companies, and then an organization called the Enterprise Center here in Chattanooga, which helps with digital literacy, and just really, had an opportunity to throw things across the table. No idea was too big or small, but what came out of that was someone asked the question. We're trying to figure out how many students lack access, and somebody asked the question, well, what if we provided internet to every low-income family in Hamilton County schools? So that bold idea, we went from there, worked with the school system and identified there's 28,500 families and living in about 17,000 households. It's a pretty big, ambitious project. From there, the next piece was, what kind of service are we going to provide? Our internet, the lowest that you can get as a consumer is 300 megabytes symmetrical. So that's upload and download speeds, and you can get up to 10 gigs if you chose to. So we said we're going to provide this service to students at our minimum speeds, and we're going to provide an in-home router, and that will cost $8 million upfront infrastructure to do that. Since we're a municipal electric company, we're restricted by state law from giving away service, so we have to charge what it costs to do installs. So since we already had everybody at the table, it was an easy ask. The foundations came together, private companies like Blue Cross Blue Shield, and the city, county, and we also eventually got state CARES money. So we got to the $8 million number pretty fast. From that point, talking about long-term solution, well, this program is going to follow these families for 10 years, at least 10 years. But our agreement with the school system is for 10 years. So if you're a family, you're on free and reduced lunch, you qualify for this program. So you reach out to the school system, sends out a survey to the families opt in, and then reach out to us to schedule install, and we'll follow those families throughout the community. Right now, we're at about 10,000 families that are connected of that 28,000. 10,000 students connected of that 28,000. So we're moving along, but we're at a point now where we're having a little challenge with getting the families that are not connected, getting them to reach out and schedule the installs, and really just to get those families engaged. This was a pretty challenging push, but if there's no time like the present if we're talking closing the digital divide. And I think the education piece was very important, because again, we're sending students home and telling them that they can't be in a building, and it's unhealthy to be in a building. So we have to come up with a solution to fix that. And I feel like in Hamilton County, we were able to do that with our community partners and everybody putting all hands on deck and just making it happen here.
Great. That's really helpful to know. I think one thing that struck me in the work that we're doing and listening to your work as well is that the number of folks who could be in the digital divide is really great. And I think what's really interesting is that it's everywhere in this country. So what we found in our report is that even in the best connected communities, 1 in 4 students are still in the digital divide. And that means there's work for everybody to do, right? Regardless of what your community looks like or what resources you have. And in some ways that's hopeful, because that means, there's something everybody can do to help close this. Daniela, do you want to talk about the work that you guys can do?
Off of mute. But yes, and Evan, I don't know if you saw, I was like nodding my head as you were talking. A lot of the things that you were saying really resonate. And I actually want to maybe follow sort of the same pattern a little bit that you did, talking about what you did in the spring. And in Rhode Island, I said our office has been working through an initiative called Connect RI for a couple of years now, partnering with some of our local and national companies, ISPs, and cell providers for tablets and devices and access. So we had those relationships, and when particularly when the pandemic hit and students had to literally like leave everything in their lockers and head home, the quick pivot was to, exactly what you said, Evan. How do we get devices out the door? How do we get immediate internet access for students? We partnered with all four of the major cell providers: Sprint, AT&T, Verizon, and T-Mobile is going to kill me for taking that long. And got them to give unlimited access to cell phone data during the spring so that we could get students online quickly. That was a great short term, but Evan, your exact point. All right, fine. We're not going to do that forever. This is not a long-term solution. So what is our long-term solution? And, if we know this problem isn't going to go away, what can we do? And we also, even during the spring, as we were working with ISPs locally and trying to get the word out about the resources that we had available to families, there were a number of families that for a number of reasons just didn't feel really comfortable letting someone into their home and, in getting themselves hooked up. So we have a very different infrastructure. Chattanooga is, for folks online who don't know much about the Chattanooga model, it's like the gold standard of municipal access. We all wish we had what you guys have, but we have different. So we had to look at what our resources were in Rhode Island, and we have a statewide fiber network managed by a nonprofit that's part of the National Quilt called Ocean, and the fiber network was built actually with federal dollars through the BTOP program back in 2010. And so I know other states have BTOP built fiber infrastructure. And what we were able to do and what we're building now is working with our Ocean partners. We're layering on, because Ocean also supports as a BTOP built fiber infrastructure. They support 100 plus of our community anchor institutions, including most of our school districts. So this was a network and a resource that we had available, and we said, how could we leverage this more so that the access wasn't just in the school building, but was available elsewhere? And so, like I was saying, we're layering on to the Ocean network, leveraging newly opened CBRS bandwidth. And this will get nerdy fast, but I think is really cool. So happy to go in the weeds at one point in time or another later.
Hold on one second before you go on. You might want to explain what CBRS stands for.
It's the community-based radio service, and it's an LTE bandwidth. So it's somewhere sort of in a sweet spot between Wi-Fi and cellular. It doesn't require the same amount of hardware as Wi-Fi does. So, you can put more people on a single router. It gets a mile in really perfect conditions, 1.5 miles radius compared to, a couple 100 meters for a Wi-Fi connection. And so it can be available a little bit more widespread than a sort of standard community mesh Wi-Fi enterprise.
And again, I'm going to just step in just so not sure what everybody is familiar with, but so, your options are typically fixed, wired, maybe something mobile, which can be, wireless. And then these sort of wireless options that are sort of this hybrid that are, hopefully serving these sort of fixed locations, but are using technology that's not, a fixed wire.
We can do a whole thing also on all the ins and outs there. But I think the main point for this is we looked at the network and the infrastructure that we had locally. So similar to what Chattanooga did, we just had a different infrastructure. It needed another layer. So we went to, those who were tech savvy and said, what could we do? Could you think bold, think big, think innovative? And there was a newly available, the federal government just opened the CBRS bandwidth recently. And we were able to leverage this moment. And what we'll end up having is basically students with SIM cards and dongles that can take their computers in our urban core and bring them home and use the district network at home. So instead of needing to worry about individual access with families in home, we're just treating the district network as a blanket. And the student can really go sort of anytime, anywhere learning, tying back into other, I know, sessions and conversations around personalization that has happened at this conference.
So I had a quick question for you. And before we move on to our next speaker, I wanted to also note that we've got a question for Evan as well. But first, I just wanted to say, you know, it's what's interesting is this sort of move from something that might be sort of more commercially familiar and somewhat short-term in its solutions, and then these sort of more sort of infrastructure-centric, kind of these like heavier solutions where we're trying to get something to the home to each of the students. Did you find like cost savings, or was it just, you know, the type of service, the quality of the service? Like what really drove you to wanting to go from something like a hotspot or, you know, simple Wi-Fi solution to trying to drive towards something more robust to the students? Daniela?
One thing is, you know, just as you're thinking, what you, Amina mentioned about the different types of internet access, we turned on hotspots. Like I said, we had great partnerships with our telcos, but if it's a parent's phone and the parent has to leave or take a call or go to the grocery store or do something, like it's gone, that internet is gone when the phone is gone. And B, the number of students, if you've got 3 students trying to Zoom on a single device, that becomes really cumbersome and tricky. And so what we were trying to find was the right sort of balance between something that we could do longer term and at cost with something that was, you know, expeditious enough to roll out. And looking at the chat, sort of how states prioritize devices versus connectivity. That's a really hard question. And what's interesting, what we've found in Rhode Island is it's almost a question for 2 different people or 2 different entities. You know, the folks who know and can do internet access from a you know, sort of system level perspective are not the same folks necessarily who should be thinking about Chromebook deployment for your district. And so if you're looking at it in terms of 2 different, no, that's sort of like a punt answer because it's sort of like both. But it should be both. And if you can do both, but asking different people to take different components of the work.
Yeah. And then speaking of, you know, who takes the lead in different issues, I think there's a question in the chat specifically about Tennessee and who took the lead driving the solution you had in Chattanooga. Was it, I think it says, was it state, district, private sector who should take the lead?
You said in Chattanooga, who took the lead?
Mm-hmm.
Or who should take the lead? I think it's a community base. I mean, for us, it was the superintendent reaching out to us and knowing that we're really community focused and community based, and since we are municipal electric, I mean the serving the community is what we do. So it was a natural fit for us to sort of be in the middle of it. But I think it's a combination of everybody. So we wouldn't be able to do this without the private side, the foundation side, and of course the city, county, and school board funding as well.
So Daniel, I wanted to turn to you. I know that you've had some really interesting work happen in Chicago, and I know a lot of us have heard about it, and so I'm really curious to hear kind of the genesis of all the work that's happened in Chicago as well.
Yeah, thank you. And I have like 1,000 questions. I'll find you afterwards, Daniela, like Evan and I found some time after our first connect. But so our organization, just to kind of give a sense of why we ended up in the middle of things, is we work directly with parents across the city of Chicago, particularly in kind of the low-income Black and Brown communities that many of my staff come from. And we're intentional about really a product design model where we're trying to listen to them as the consumers of the school system to design systems and policies that align with what they want and need for their kids. So in that work, we listen to them, and then we go with them to whoever owns the system or policy, and really just let them have the microphone to kind of say, this is what we need to happen. And then our job from there, at that point on, is to help build whatever. If there's agreement that we need to build it, which usually there is when a lot of families show up and say we need this, we then say to whoever owns this situation, system or policy, that we'll help them build it. It's theirs, but our job is just to be technical support to get it done, where parents can be part of the process of designing it. And so I know that sounds like kind of a mouthful, but basically what happened is we were doing our usual work and COVID hit. And what our families prioritize is where we go. And so our families, from a prioritization standpoint, there's a lot of issues that families face routinely in Chicago and other cities when it comes to education. But this issue with internet connectivity and the digital divide went from number 10 to number 1. And it went to number 1 because when we talk to our families, they can walk and chew gum at the same time like all of us. They're not just talking about the education of their kids. They're talking about, whether or not they're going to put food on the table. I think when we went into quarantine, we were a week out from spring break. It was the end of March. And we had families who lost, two jobs, 2 head of households lost their jobs. They were worried about paying rent at the end of that March. And at the same time, they're talking about, when my kid comes back from spring break, what am I going to do if we're supposed to be online? And so our job at that point was to just understand how big and broad the issue was. And I think, Amina, you kind of cited some of the data, but when we look at Chicago, the disconnectivity rate is pretty alarming when you take what we're hearing from families and we magnify it up and look at data trends. It was 1 in 5 households that were disconnected, which is close to your 1 in 4, but it's 1 in 3 when you talk about the neighborhoods that we work in. And we had city census blocks where it was 80% of households that didn't have internet. And so, just those stats alone were kind of staggering. And our job was to elevate the issue, and we kind of patched together what our parents were saying with what the numbers were saying. And we shared that broadly through a brief and as part of that work, we're not looking to just kind of rattle the bell and get people to run around and panic. We wanted to talk about what were potential solutions. And so there were conversations we were having with ISPs in the Chicago area around what was possible. And we looked at a whole host of different options. Some of them I've never heard that I think both my two fellow panelists here have shared some things that I'm like, okay, this is stuff for us to be thinking about long term. But what we realized very quickly is that in a place like Chicago, coverage for the internet is pretty ubiquitous. You can have it if you want it. It's 99% of the city has option to get a wireline outside of some rare circumstances. And that was the best option. And there were ways to deploy that very quickly if we could stand up a program. And so what we have in Chicago, as a result of the brief, we ended up immediately in a conversation with the city and with the school district, Chicago Public Schools, as well as a number of really kind of incredible philanthropic partners that stepped up. And we have a sponsorship program. Our target is to address the roughly 100,000 students that we know are disconnected in the city of Chicago. In the public school system, which is 60,000 households, is roughly how the math kind of works out. We have connected half of those households at this point. We're at about 34,000 households that have been connected, which is 50,000 kids, which is a huge number, but we're only halfway to where we need to be. And I look at the clock ticking and I think, it's November and kids are still pulling their homework off their phones or finding ways to get packets or not engaging at all. So there's some pretty significant consequences to not being connected. And at the same time, this is incredibly hard work and no one's done it before. I think all 3 of us are recognizing that just connecting families is not just turning a switch on. And so a lot of our work right now is just the implementation of this program. Families just have to, just like what Evan was sharing in our case, families just have to notify the district that they're interested in the service. They get a code, they call one of the internet service providers, Comcast or RCN, and they're provided access. And a lot of the installations can be done remotely, but there are protocols to do it in person if necessary. So that's pretty high level, kind of what we're doing in Chicago. I think that the big next phase for us is twofold. It's how do we connect as many families as we can by the end of this year, calendar year, and then really, as we roll into the school year. We have a 4-year program where the first 2 years are sponsored, and the second by CARES funding and philanthropic support, and the second 2 years and then onward are covered by the city and in the district. And in the grand scheme of things, it's about $11 million a year on, and I take Chicago Public Schools budget is a $6 billion plus budget. So, they have milk contracts that are bigger than that. And when you think about the consequences of families being disconnected and kids being disconnected in this new, I know that was one of the questions in the chat. So, we kind of look at it as we have to figure out a way to do this whether we want to or not. So, that is kind of the broad stroke of the program. A lot of work to do, and what do we do long term is still kind of a question that we need to answer.
So I've got, one thing that I just keep hearing from all three of you is this sense of long term. That we had a moment in the beginning where we were rushing to deal with an immediate problem and an emergency, and now there's not just sort of a long term nature to the emergency, but also an opportunity to try to address this long-standing problem around the digital divide and students, and maybe just the digital divide within your own community. This can be a sort of an entree, a starting point to trying to close that gap generally. Do you feel like there is an opportunity to extend all of the efforts that you've done in a way that will last beyond sort of the crisis and sort of this emergency moment? And then the follow-up to that is, how do you fund that? Do you need support? Do you think you can do that with the sort of existing funds that you've put together? Or do you feel like now there's this second moment where we need to look at sort of policymakers building something long-term in terms of funding as well? I'll just open that up to the group.
I will say just quickly, I think it depends on the type of access that we get a lot into conversations exactly around policy and role of state when you think about in-home. Where we've landed with the CBRS pilot is looking to drill down to a $5 per student per month price point, which we think is manageable within district budget, and or supplemented long-term with local philanthropic money. I will put a plug in for those who are at the national level and talking about this. There's a question on whether we might be able to eventually, with some tweaks, use E-rate money for this. E-rate has not typically been allowed to be used to support internet access for students outside of school buildings. And so if we can, I know the last go around to shift E-rate took a long time, and it's not the sexiest of topics in the policy landscape, but it would be a game changer for local districts and for families. And so I would say we're looking to have this be a locally paid for, district paid for initiative, but I would be remiss if I did not advocate for my districts. All of our districts who are in our pilot are 90% reimbursement districts through E-rate. This would be a huge boon for them.
So I'm gonna back up a little because not everybody knows what E-rate is potentially. That's on this call, and so E-rate is part of a suite of programs called the Universal Service Fund, and it's a program that for decades now has supported schools and libraries and anchor institutions in connecting their actual institution. It allows for some internal networking and then also the actual connectivity. And then most recently, it's allowed for dark fiber as well. Some of the stuff that you've been talking about, which is an innovation to E-rate, would be to find a way to take advantage of these already sort of government-funded networks that are in use and available, and finding a way to take that excess capacity and use it more efficiently into the community for student need. And I think that's a really interesting option. That's something Common Sense has been supportive of, and I think potentially, as this is a longer-term solution, that's something that probably the next FCC and the next administration may consider as well. and should consider as part of, what may come up in terms of modernization.
The last thing I'll say quickly on funding and then I'll shut up because I've dominated too much lately, is we're also looking, if you think about, Danielle, your point on people can walk and chew gum at the same time, right? Our families are not just students and parents, but they exist in general communities. And so we're also looking at leveraging CDBG money, which is another acronym, I understand, but is another tranche of federal funds that are specifically focused for community development. And if you're looking at this as community development with the added benefit of school, there's a way to balance and gather and utilize some CDBG money for things like this also.
We need to find either you got to answer what some of these funding streams are here, or we can find time afterwards to talk about, because I think part of the funding kind of support to get Chicago Connected off the ground was anchored in the reality that this is far more than just students and their learning. Like there was a workforce development component to it. There's a question about digital literacy that was kind of in the chat that is a big piece of the program. So we know that we can't just turn the lights on and then expect them to understand how to like jump on and get what they need. So there's a big part of this that the second highest price tag for us beyond connecting families, like the internet service itself, is funding community-based partners to work with their communities on digital literacy and connecting hard to reach families, which when I think about like the numbers and how hard it is to connect families, like that's been a big piece of getting families connected, is having a trusted person reach out, in like literally call them to make that human contact to get them connected. But I mean, to answer your question, Amina, from my side, and I think I wanted to be Evan to the punch, because I think he's gonna make us all smile when we realize just how affordable this could be, because I've heard some of his numbers and they're incredible, and they really are a model for the country. But the cost of not doing this is far higher than the cost of doing it. Like I think it's a really, like, we're not thinking about it the right way when we think about who's going to pay for it. If we think about like what is actually happening when we don't. I mean, the fact that there's a homework gap, and I know that everybody is on this call right now, like, would not tolerate a situation where their kid could not answer a question at 8 p.m. at night. So why do we think that that is okay to do to families that may not be able to afford it for whatever reason? And in this case, like, the arguments for how costly it is, I think, start to dwindle when you hear some of the stats that my friend over here from Chattanooga is going to share in a second. So I'll pass it over to Evan, because I think he can talk about what the costs really are. But there's no reason we shouldn't be doing this.
And Daniel, you are working with a much bigger city, so I had to throw that plug in there too, and I appreciate that. Yeah, so our costs ongoing. So it was $8 million upfront infrastructure, and to your point about what's the cost of not doing this, when we had discussions with the city and county and about funding this upfront infrastructure, it was a no-brainer. We were talking about students and kids, but when you start talking about these are low-income families that we're worrying about we're talking about workforce development opportunities. We're talking about telehealth opportunities. And how we can improve those outcomes. And these are families that now have access, that don't have to worry about, trying to find transportation to get to the library, to put in an application for a job, and use a computer that one they may or may not know how to use. So partnering, like here locally, we have the Enterprise Center that does a Tech Go Home program. So they've been really instrumental in helping those families once they're connected, making sure that they can use the device and understand the ins and outs of that. As far as our cost long term, we were the 10-year number it is about $710,000 a year. So it's about 7.1 million, and that ends up being about $2.50 per family for ongoing cost, and that's going to be bared partly by the school system and partly by us. And the school system just started a foundation not too long ago to go towards EdConnect family. So hopefully that won't have to be a budget item that the school board has to approve going on, assuming that the foundation is going. But the community's really gotten together and helped put that upfront infrastructure cost. And I think again, what is the cost if we don't do this? And right now, all eyes the whole world is feeling COVID. There's not a single person, in the world that's not feeling COVID right now. And if you think about all the folks that lack internet access, whether that's because they chose not to or they can't afford it, but the powers to be, so to speak, that forever have not really thought about it. This in their lap now. This is affecting them. This is affecting their children, and this is just the great time to talk about long-term solution if we're going to talk money and policy, because everybody is touching and feeling it right now.
Hey, Evan, just super quick. Sorry, Amina. It's $250 for how long?
It's $2.50 per month for family, and that's for over the 10 years.
That's an incredible number. And again, what's the speeds that you're offering?
It's 300 megs. The majority, the original project was 100 megs, just because we had some routers that people already had in their homes. That was their minimum speed. But everybody's going to get about 300 megs symmetrical. So that's upload, download. There's no data caps or anything like that.
Yeah, and like to remind folks, our top number in our report was 210, which is a big number. Most people will raise their eyebrows up. So to hear that it's 250 or 300 is incredibly impressive. So it seems like we're leaning towards talking about sort of some of the underlying sort of hurdles to having connectivity for students at home, and the costs that come with that. And it seems like all three of you have thought really hard about how to lower those costs and get more robust service to the student. Do you think there is a connection between, is it sort of more of a connection between just services available, or do you think there's a component of sort of rethinking what we do around infrastructure?
I'll hop in here. I think it's I think it's all of it. And for us, like, so we have the fiber infrastructure, and I know they're smart people, way smarter than me in our strategic research department. They're thinking forward and looking at opportunities. But I know using the spectrum band that Rhode Island that Daniela is talking about, those are things that we picked around for. But I think ultimately each community has to look at the assets that they have and what makes sense for their community. So as far as like a policy and infrastructure look, I think local folks having the opportunity to say, hey, this works for us. Like here, what works in Chattanooga might not work in the mountainous areas of Northeast Tennessee. There might be something more of a wireless option there. But I think just having an all the above approach, and I think right now policy wise is kind of they've kind of pigeon-toed everybody into one little corner. And this is when we talk about infrastructure, it's only this what we talk about, and it's not like really a broad spectrum of ideas. But
one thing that I've noticed that has really driven the discussion around the digital divide as of late has been the concept around education and the digital divide. I think in part that's because so many schools have been doing their own assessments since March in terms of figuring out what students have access to, what students need. And so schools have taken on this incredible presence on the issue of the digital divide that maybe because they didn't have that data in hand, they could talk about the importance of connectivity with its relationship to education. But now schools have real data that they can offer policymakers to help inform their next decision around cost supports, around device purchasing, around and infrastructure deployment too. Do you think assessments were a part of your approach?
I'll jump in and say we in Rhode Island have not had broadband maps aside from those done through the FCC for 6 years now. And I often get the first question I get when we talk about connectivity generally is, well, we've got ocean. We have, everyone's connected in Rhode Island. There's not really a problem. And having the district level student data, with districts asking how many families. I mean, I've been saying, but no, we have lots of people, and I just didn't have the maps. But having these data and actually building out over the last couple months maps within our urban core, particularly, has really been has changed the discourse. And so, yes, I think that those conversations that districts have had have really driven forward. And I think it also has, I want to just piggyback a little bit on the infrastructure question, highlighted the need for different types of infrastructure in different environments. And so we actually find in Rhode Island that our rural areas are not nearly as disconnected as our urban areas. And whereas there is ample infrastructure in our urban areas, we're still not reaching a lot of folks, which begs the question, is the issue an affordability issue? Yes. And or is the issue that we have the wrong infrastructure? And maybe yes also. And so it opens up. And so I think, Amina, just to your point on, is it an infrastructure play? I'd say yes. And what type of? It might be multiple types of infrastructure. It doesn't just have to be one. And Evan, I think that riffs off what you were saying too.
Yeah, I'm not sure how much I can add. I agree with all those points. I mean, I think there is the question, and this is something that we've seen just from the engagement piece of our work in Chicago, is that there's also a bad data question, right? Like, we're finding families that don't want to take on the program because they have other access that we didn't know about. And to the extent that that's the case, I mean, I think we have to figure out what it is. But it also speaks to your point, Daniela, about the infrastructure and what we're serving, because 25, we're offering like the bare minimum definition of broadband, which is 25.3. And Amina, you shared at the beginning, like, that's not enough for a lot of families. And even families that, may have to make tough decisions about how they spend their income are making a decision or finding other ways to get better internet. And so I think and that's just the internet side of this piece. And then there's the question that just got thrown out that I think sort of connects to this, which is just the trust gap. Like, that is a big piece for us about getting people connected. It is why part of our program is designed to be community partners and is about, the numbers of phone calls we've made, close to 200,000 now. I think we're past of direct phone calls to human to basically kind of combat, what happens, which is when you send something out that says, hey, this is free, a lot of people justifiably are like, yeah, that's going in the trash. So we're combating that. I think all three of us know that that's real. And the best way to combat it is to have people actually speaking directly to people. And then over time, awareness builds that, hey, this program is legitimate. And it's really been community-based partners who have been a huge part of this, and their peers of folks who get connected, reaching out to their fellows to say, this is real and it's for you.
So, we are about to embark on a new legislative session in most states and at the federal level as well. And there's still a lot of action actually at the federal level right now as we speak, and hopefully another would really form of funding for distance learning. If you were to talk to a policymaker about what your project, what your community needs to be able to be sustainable, what are the sort of, in the short term, what are the sort of asks, and in the long term, do you think they're similar asks, or is there something different that you would be looking for?
Jump in.
I think short term for us is like, there's a continued push. It depends on what timing we're talking about, but there's a continued push to connect as many people as possible while we're living through this pandemic, because the consequences across every domain, whether it's education and beyond. And so, any additional kind of support in various different innovative ways around that is critical. I think the device issue for us was, at least for student populations, wasn't as much of an issue because we had a district that had already distributed a large portion of devices to families. But there is a need for every household to have their own device, because what we found was the device would go home with the student and become the device for the family. So there's those gaps that still persist. And in Chicago, for every household that's disconnected that has kids in it, there's 2 that are disconnected that don't. And so there's real consequences when you have a disconnected community. And we know that that bleeds into kids' education as well as a whole host of other places. Long term, one of the things that was a positive kind of outcropping of all this work is that the city in the recent election put a referendum vote up on whether or not internet should be a public service for the city, and it got 90% support. And so it's non-binding, but it is something that kind of sets the table, I think, for a longer discussion. And there's stuff happening at the state level, at least in Illinois, around how do you think about internet more as a public utility, and how to kind of address the digital divide. It is going to look very different in Chicago than it will in more rural spaces, but long term, I think we need to start thinking differently about what access to internet is. It's not a luxury anymore, right? It's just too important for so many families, for so many different reasons.
And I would just add, for policymakers, there are many bills in this world that can hurt more than they can help. And so we have some in Rhode Island, but also some of our local, our nearby counterparts have bills that we don't have, and we are very thankful that we don't have them. About half the states, I believe, have legislation that would actually disallow things like Evann's Chattanooga model from being able to exist. And I think all done with the best of intentions, but it's also just good to be aware for, as we're thinking about policy, what might end up stymieing ability to do some of these new types of models or things that we didn't even know, like the CBRS bandwidth that we didn't know we would have 3 years ago. And if we had put legislation akin to what is in Massachusetts that disallows a Chattanooga type of approach, we'd be in trouble. And so I think the other thing to consider about what we should add into policy is just for our policymakers listening is be really mindful about, what we shouldn't add as well.
And I'll just piggyback on that too. And, there's a lot of stigma about it being, municipal owned. Since we're a government-owned utility, then the conversation is, oh, we're competing with private, and in some cases that's true, and in a lot of cases it's not. Like if you think about all the rural areas right now or cities that lack access, well, why is that? So I think that question should be asked by a legislator. Why is that? Why is nobody there serving? And you'll quickly come to find out that most people that get in, that there's some sort of government funding that push it there. So the argument that government shouldn't be doing it, government is doing it everywhere, even with the ISP. So, but my thing, and not to get salty there, but my solution would be, and what I try to say is that it's an all above approach. I think it takes our model. I think it takes private model. I think it takes for your community, it varies, and I think that if you're writing legislation, then there should be no barriers restricting anybody from solving a problem that we're trying to fix. And if you do that, then I think on some level it'll take care of itself. But just have our model is just another tool in the toolbox, and it's not a solution for everybody. And so it works for us, and it may not work in other places. But you shouldn't stop cities or counties or areas from doing something that works for their particular area. Legislatively.
We've sort of dug into the infrastructure piece pretty heavily, but I wanted to kind of dial back a little bit and talk through, what maybe your sort of education partners have been asking for, throughout this process. In part, did that help drive? I know that we've said multiple times everybody has their own sort of unique ecosystem of telecommunication services and potential devices that might be in play within a school district or within a system. But what were educators asking for? Did that change over time? Did that help move sort of your thinking around what suite of options you would try to deliver for them.
I think I know just originally in our conversation, I think on a high level, there have been discussion with the school system and with teachers and educators on going to one-to-one and being able to have this digital service, but it really wasn't pushed until our current situation. So now, we have the connectivity piece, and now, just as a community working with like the enterprise center and stuff like that, with how can we do educational programs, within the school system, but how can we help support that as a community, to make sure people are up to speed on how to use technology, how to use devices. And then on top of that, how can families and parents who all of a sudden are now homeschool parents what curriculum are they getting to be able to learn and help support their kid that's at home. So having those conversations, and that last piece really drove from the teachers, because the teachers are at home and they're trying to explain something to students that don't understand, and they're trying to explain it to parents that definitely don't understand. And so really getting that piece together and coming together as a community to help support that has been what we've been asked to help do.
I want to just quick, a couple points on teachers. One was in the chat, educators and access. That was one thing we heard from districts was, could we pay for teachers' access or TAs' access? And so one thing we were mindful of with the pilot that we're running for our urban core is that expanded district access means expanded access for educators also, because it's something owned and run by the district and not paid for. The district paying an additional benefit to individual educators versus others, which got into a whole thing of differentiated pay structure and union stuff and all things of if I pay your internet bill versus yours or whatever. So that was, just sort of access was one thing that we were considering, but also things that we've heard from educators that are important to keep in mind in this conversation is privacy and security. Just really nervous that their kids are going to get into websites and stuff that they shouldn't get into. And that was a consideration with building out the network that our district network, because they could keep a firewall in place for that network. The other thing we heard, which we have not resolved, but I think it's important to call out, we are in the middle right now in Rhode Island of redoing a set of curricula. The state is giving recommended curricula, and districts are re-upping their curricula, and curricula that are available on paper and equally readily available and accessible and good in an online form are not always, they might be one or the other. And so a lot of our educators said, could we make sure that we've got ones that are good for both? We don't want to just get paper curriculum that we then have to figure out what to do with in an online context. So that one, I just say we haven't totally gotten it right yet, but it has been something we've heard a lot from educators.
Yeah, I think just to round out, what we heard on our side, and we've worked predominantly with the district, and we've heard this channel up through teachers, but predominantly from school leaders, is just around eligibility for the program. When we first opened it up, we could not open the floodgates and expect the ISPs to be able to handle just because of the scale in terms of signups. And so we were very intentional about having kind of an equity framework to figure out where the highest need be first and work our way up from there. But all along the way, we've had, various different educators kind of leaning in and saying, hey, you need to open up eligibility because we have families that need this program. And I think one of the things that just, we learned very quickly is that our data weren't always up to speed. COVID has changed people's familial circumstances and economic situations readily for the last 6 months, just like that, something changes in a family and suddenly they need a program like this. And relying on historic data to kind of figure out eligibility was something that we had to kind of pivot away from eventually. And so I'm excited because we're about to open up the program in full. We think that we have enough capacity to service people that need it in the city of Chicago to the 60,000 households we want to reach. And now it'll just be open to whoever kind of raises their hand and says that they need it, which is a huge win for teachers and school leaders because that's what they've been asking for. So that's kind of the next phase. And I think it's going to be a really important one for the program to continue to add, families that need support.
Thank you, everybody that's joined us today, and thank you for these awesome speakers and all the work that they're doing. I mean, I have to say the digital divide is not a topic that usually gives you a lot of hope, but listening to these three speakers today has been incredibly hopeful and inspirational. It's great to see so much positive work being done, and then also so much interesting thought about how to keep it going. And that's really wonderful to see. So thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. And because I'm me and I have to, my last plug for folks thinking about doing family outreach and really trying to break through that, the potential barriers of distrust. We've worked a lot with our commerce and economic development team who are doing door-to-door and direct business supports for small businesses in a lot of our communities. People aren't just parents, they're also business leaders. And if there are ways to sort of get partnerships that you might not think of to be able to reach families as like holistic humans. And we've had some good luck with our Commerce Corporation on that front.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone.
Thank y'all.